This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software. Developers, are you ready? It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. Choose your language, choose your tools, choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. When you can make faster decisions, there's no telling what you'll create. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
Hello everyone, welcome to Software Engineering Radio. Today we welcome Ryan Ripley to our show. Ryan is a professional Scrum trainer and host of the podcast Agile for Humans. In the past, Ryan has worked as a software developer, in engineering management, and as a Scrum Master at many companies. Ryan also has a new book, Fixing Your Scrum: Practical Solutions to Common Scrum Problems. Welcome to the show, Ryan. Is there anything in your bio that you'd like to add?
No, that's really nicer than what I deserve. So thank you so much, and thanks for having me on the show.
Before we start, I'd like to call out some related episodes. There has been a recent episode that contrasts Agile with Waterfall, episode 401. And there are also some older episodes, episode 60, 161, 170, and 181. We'll have link in the show notes. While these were recorded several years ago, I believe they're still excellent introductions to Scrum, its roles and artifacts, and some best practices. So today we don't plan to cover the basics of Scrum. Instead, we want to focus on anti-patterns that dull the impact of Scrum. With that, let me ask you, Ryan, why do organizations want to adopt Scrum?
I actually don't think Scrum's the goal. It's interesting. I think organizations are trying to figure out how do we build the right thing at the right time for the right customer. And so they're after delivery, they're after customer satisfaction, they're after consistency, they're after all these great things, and the current methods don't work. Trying to pick big dates out in the future and land to those targets and negotiating all of those big upfront design projects, they haven't traditionally hit those really important targets that I just mentioned. And so companies are turning to empiricism, right? So they're learning by doing, right? Empirical process control means that we take observed behaviors, observed outcomes, and we inspect what's going on through transparent work, and we make adaptations frequently as we go. And so right now, Scrum is the only framework out there that at least I'm aware of that allows us to actually do that. And so when people say, why would companies want Scrum? My usual answer is they don't. They want to be able to deliver something that people want. And right now, Scrum is what's empowering companies to do that.
That makes sense. So I'm wondering though, why does the Scrum Guide call Scrum as difficult to master?
It's interesting. Scrum is, I liken it to the game of chess, right? So chess has very simple rules, and you can learn the rules in an afternoon, and it takes people years or even a lifetime to hit a grandmaster high level. I think the same is true with Scrum. You can read it's 17 pages. You could read it in one sitting. You could start doing some of the events and start working with some of the artifacts and the roles very quickly. But what we find out is the second you start using Scrum, impediments occur. And the ways that your organization currently works, wow, we run into some friction. And so it takes a very long time to learn how to leverage agility, how to leverage empiricism, how to leverage Scrum in a way that's actually an advantage for your company. Early on, it's very disruptive. And so it takes years and years and years. Like these ideas that you'll see in our industry, 6 months we'll do an agile transformation and everything will be perfect. Run away from that. Like that's snake oil. That's nonsense. It takes many, many years of practice, of work, of application, in order to get an organization truly working in a great way with Scrum, with Kanban, with any of these agile methods. And so, yes, very simple rules, very small Scrum guide, very quick to read, but it takes years to unravel organizational dysfunction. It takes years to change mindsets from command and control to servant leadership. It takes years to really get these lessons learned and to change the DNA of a company. So yes, Scrum is very simple to learn, but it takes years and years and years to master because of all of those other things happening around us.
What are some of the prereqs, though, that an organization should have before they even start?
I'm not sure if there's a prerequisite, right? I think that any organization developing products could adopt Scrum. I think decide. You know what? I should change that. A good prerequisite. The leadership team is on board with the shifts in mindset and with the changes in the way we're trying to work. Right? If leadership is on board, I think that leads to a much higher potential for success. But as far as any other prereq, we just need to get started, right? What gets me is so many organizations try to use waterfall to implement Agile. They call in a big box company with a 3-letter acronym for its name, and they say, "Give us the 2-year plan to adopt Agile." And they lay out a 2-year roadmap, and they give them the playbook and all these other things that are anti-Agile, that are completely not congruent with the principles and values of Agile, and try to plan out using waterfall and Agile implementation. Sometimes we just need to get started. It's through doing. So there's this great Agilist out there. His name's Woody Zool. He has a great Twitter feed at Woody Zool. And if you follow it, you see a lot of his Agile maxims. And one of them that I really love is, it is through doing the work that we learn about the work we need to do. And so sometimes we have to get in, dig into the work, get a little bit done, get some feedback to figure out if what we're doing is right. And I wish companies would take that approach instead. So prerequisite would be leadership on board. The second would be throw out the playbooks and do many, many small experiments, adapt and learn, inspect and adapt, and keep going towards continual improvement. And I think those two things will take companies very, very far.
Got it. So the organization gets started. I'm sure every organization customizes these processes.
Sure.
So, how would you distinguish between customizing it to meet the needs of the company versus doing it completely wrong and, still get the essence of Scrum? What do you think can be changed and should not be touched?
I leave the framework alone is the advice I give. So the Scrum framework has a lot of air in between, right? There's a lot of space between the events and the artifacts and the roles, to where companies can do a lot of things that make sense to them within their context. The only rule that I often will give is, do not change the framework itself. When when they feel this desire, this need to change the framework, to modify Scrum in some way, it's usually to cover up some kind of impediment or some kind of organizational dysfunction. So rather than change Scrum, change the way you're working, right? Because there's probably something you're covering up that will bubble up later, regardless of the change you make today. So I just treat it as it's a scaffolding. It's a framework. You can do a lot of smart custom things within the boundaries of Scrum, but please do not change the framework itself.
Okay, the organization took your advice, they got started, they kept the framework in place. Now, after some time, how do they know it's working? How do they know that it's a successful adoption versus something is wrong?
Are we able to deliver? Are we delivering high quality, potentially releasable products that delight customers? If we're getting to done and the customers are satisfied, right? So if we have ROI, if we have customer satisfaction, if we're having an impact on the world, all of those things are great measures of making sense of whether or not you're being successful. But I think first and foremost, like, I think there's a lot of different types of agilists. I do not fall into the camp of the touchy feely, drum circle kumbaya type of agile coach or scrum master. I am very much centered on delivery. So if we cannot ship an increment of product by the end of a sprint, that is the first sign to me that we are not being successful. If we have customers who are not delighted by our products, if we have people who are not willing to pay for the things that we're building, that's probably another sign that we've made a mistake. But for me, first and foremost, an organization's ability to actually ship something is where I typically look first.
Let's talk a little bit of the evolution of the Scrum Guide itself. So, when were the Scrum values added to the guide and why? And are there any other significant additions that have been made over the years?
I'm trying to remember which exact revision the Scrum values came back. And it was it might have been the 2011 change. And I think that was significant. It's interesting. In the original, there's the black covered book where that Ken Schwaber and Mike Beadle co-authored, and the values are in that book. So the values have been with Scrum for a very long time, and for some reason they missed putting the values in a few versions of the Scrum Guide. Thankfully, they brought them back, and I think that's one of the biggest changes to the guide, simply because it's very easy to turn Scrum into a process. Right? Keep in mind, it's a framework. It's not a process. And so people will try to take a very legalistic viewpoint of Scrum. They'll try to turn it into, steps 1 through 100 to product delivery nirvana. They'll do all of these crazy things. Like I've seen companies and organizations where here's our 350-page playbook on how to do Scrum here. That's totally antithetical to the philosophy and the principles behind Scrum itself. Instead, the values came back and they gave us some insights into, yes, the events and the artifacts and the roles are important, but this is a human practice. And so behavior is paramount, right? People and culture will crush a Scrum implementation faster than anything else. And so these values of focus, openness, commitment, courage, and respect, they really teach us that culture is really important. And the fact that these values exist and can help us are really important. It's why I talk about leadership going first. If the leadership team does not believe in focus, which means doing fewer things at once but getting things to done, there's a problem. If they don't believe that openness is important, right? Openness to new ideas, openness to being wrong, openness to support, diversity, inclusion, all these things, we're going to have a problem. If commitment is misunderstood, far too often commitment is interpreted as commitment to scope, which we never commit to in Scrum. We never commit to scope. We commit to bringing our best selves forward. We commit to being a positive teammate. We commit to a sprint goal. Commitment is all over the framework, but never to scope. And that's one of the big misunderstandings. Courage is essential. It's going to take courage to tell a stakeholder no. It's going to take courage to tell a customer not yet. It's going to take courage to speak truth to power. And if we can't do that, our Scrum practice will be flawed. And respect. Think about all the challenging, difficult things I just listed. If we can't do those things respectfully, this all falls apart. And so these behaviors came back and really made a significant shift in the way that people and organizations view Scrum, hopefully for the better. I think that, as you noted, was a major change. And I think it's one of the most significant they've done in a very long time.
So it's either in your book or in an email from you that you said you don't believe in scaling Scrum. I'd like to understand that a little bit.
Yeah.
The Scrum Guide does say that the strength of an individual team can be expanded to networks of teams. But I'm confused by your statement. Could you elaborate?
I've yet to run into a company where scaling was appropriate. I think, very large companies especially, they jump straight into scaling. They'll go do safe, they'll do Nexus, they'll do less, they'll do dad, they'll do whichever flavor of scaling they've picked out, but without ever actually having a single successful Scrum team off the ground and running, right? And so to me, it's an extreme statement, and it definitely gets attention, but I really mean it. Where I've yet to see where scaling made sense. Let's get amazing at Scrum. Let's actually have some Scrum teams stood up. You can have 4 or 5 Scrum teams up without the scaling frameworks in place, and really learn how to make Scrum work as a competitive advantage for your organization, and really work hard to get the impediments out of the way and to make the cultural changes necessary and to change the way that the organization is structured. Get all of that stuff figured out. And when you've done that, then start thinking about how do we scale this out to 100, 1,000, how many people we have. But let's get good at Scrum first. And really that's at the center of that comment that I made.
Let's talk about roles a little bit. And I'd like to start with the role of engineering management. Like you said, getting engineering leadership buy-in or just leadership buy-in is important. So why is the role of engineering management missing from the Scrum Guide?
The development team is a self-organizing, cross-functional group of people who are capable of delivering product, right? And so in that sense, engineering managers can make a great impact in clearing impediments. They can make a great impact in taking care of the HR functions, but we're not looking to outside people telling a dev team how to do their work anymore. When we empower a dev team to decide how best to do their work, we're telling those 9, 10 individuals, how many ever people are on the dev team, look, we trust you to be a organizing cross-functional team. You're going to figure out how best to do your work. We're going to hold you accountable to getting to done. We're going to hold you accountable to delivery, but you get to decide how to get there with some constraints along the way. And so from a Scrum perspective, whether you have an engineering manager, a people manager, a lead architect, whatever structures and boundaries you put in place outside of the Scrum team, that's up to your organization, right? It's a framework. But when we have that dev team in place, these are empowered people and they are cross-functional and they are capable of delivering an increment. And if they're not, maybe we can lean on that engineering manager or that architect or whoever it is to help. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that brings me to the Scrum Master, because he seems pretty key in this. What experience must a Scrum Master have?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've met Scrum Masters who came from a business analyst background. I've met Scrum Masters who have been developers. I came from a development background and then went into some project management and then a Scrum Master role. I've seen people decide that leadership wasn't their, being on a director, a VP, whichever level they were at, that didn't work for them, and they became a Scrum Master. So I'm not sure experience is critical, and as far as like in any one area, I've actually seen where Scrum Masters who were previously developers caused a lot of harm. They thought they knew best. They started giving direction to a dev team. They started kind of interfering with some of the boundaries of the roles. And so we have to be really careful how some of that plays out. I think there are some important things though that can help. When I'm thinking about who could be a Scrum Master or what are we looking for, there's 3 things that really come to mind. It's this person that's going to fill a Scrum Master role. They have to love their team. And it's a weird word to use in tech and in product, right? But what we really mean is they have a deep care for the people that they're serving. And that we have to have this feeling in place, because the second thing is this person, this Scrum Master, has to want every member on this team and the collective team to be as wildly successful as possible. And so as a Scrum Master, I'm helping people get promoted. I'm trying to get people elevated in their careers. I'm trying to help them get leveled up. I'm putting their career advancement ahead of my own. Right? I am literally serving them to get them to higher levels of success and achievement. And the final thing that I really have to have wired in my head is that I have zero tolerance for organizational impediments. I refuse to let something in the organization sit idle that's keeping my team from delivering, right? I have zero tolerance for the things holding us back. And so do I have to go and tactfully work with people to solve those? Absolutely. But I do not let those things sit. And so if I truly love the team, I want them to be wildly successful, and I have zero tolerance for the things that are getting in the way, that's what I'm looking for, because I can teach the framework. I hope I can. That's how I make a living these days, right? So I'm a professional Scrum trainer with Scrum.org. I hope I can teach the framework. But what I cannot do is put those 3 things into someone's brain. So whether they come from a project management background, a development background, a leadership background, I've even seen people who have come from an educational, like a teaching background, who have stepped into this role beautifully. As long as they have that mindset, that servant leadership mindset locked in, and that they're serving others and they're trying to elevate others, and no tolerance for organizational impediments, I think we can teach the rest.
Okay, so I was going to ask you, what role does certification play? So you did talk about the fact that understanding the framework is important.
Yep.
Is there anything else that's important about the certification?
What I love about being a trainer for Scrum.org is we have separated the training from the certification, right? I think the certification is a credential. I think it gives people a sense of what you've worked at. I think it gives people a sense of an accomplishment that you've achieved. I'll tell you what, if you can pass the PSM2 or the PSM3, so the Professional Scrum Master Level 2 and 3 from Scrum.org, I will interview you. If I'm hiring, you automatically get in a live interview, right? Those are tricky assessments. They show a high level of skill. I think that's meaningful. But for me, I'm really looking for experience, right? So I think it's an important blend. I would caution people, don't put so much emphasis on the certificate. The classes are important too, but it's really the experience and how much impact you've had on your Scrum teams that are really the most important, right? And so I think it's a balance. The certs can offer some really good information about people, but ultimately, have you had an impact on your Scrum team? Have you actually helped a team deliver? Have you empowered someone to do something they didn't think they could do? Have you removed an organizational issue that led to a great thing? I think that's the really important stuff. The certs can help along the way because they can I've always used certifications myself as a guidepost for learning. Like it gave me a structure and a boundary, a goal to achieve. I think that's a great way to use them, and they certainly have a place, and they're certainly important. But man, it's the how we apply that cert, how we apply that learning. Are we making people's lives better? That's the really important outcome, in my opinion.
So, the purpose of the Scrum Master is to enable the team to succeed by removing impediments or any other ways. So, what are the things that Scrum Masters should not do? What are the anti patterns to watch out for?
Well, we wrote a whole book on that. Fixing Your Scrum, Practical Solutions to Common Scrum Problems. So Todd Miller and I co-wrote that book. It's available now, Amazon and pragprog.com. The whole book is full of things that a Scrum Master should not do, right? I think when we take away the agency of others is where we really make a huge mistake, right? So when we step in and try to fulfill the product owner's role for them, or when we step in and tell the dev team what to do, or when we step in and when we neglect the organization, like we don't go out and talk to leadership, we don't talk to HR, we ignore the mechanisms around the dev team, I think we do the most disservice, right? And so don't do that. Like go out there, and if you can fulfill your 3 levels of service to the product owner, to the dev team, and to the org, and to do that in a way to where you are empowering others and not stepping in and commanding and demanding, I think you'll end up okay. But if not, check the book. There are definitely a lot of anti-patterns there and some interesting ways to help you diagnose and solve those issues.
So, don't command and don't demand.
It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But we see so many Scrum Masters violate this. You are a servant leader when you're in a Scrum Master role. And some people might have an issue with that. I'm not saying you're a doormat. There are times when you have to take direct action, right? There are times when your job is to uphold Scrum or protect the team or to do all these great things. But you know what? That's not most of the time. Most of the time, you're there to help people discover their own truths for themselves or to coach them in a way to where they discover their best answer that applies to their situation, or to go out and build relationships that clear impediments that help others have great success. And I think if we're doing that more often, then the times when we step in and take direct action are less damaging, right? So don't be a doormat. You're still in a powerful, influential role, but you wield that power in such a way that you're promoting and building other people up, not commanding and directing them. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I think also maybe I'd just like to say that the Scrum Master is the big bridge between the team and everybody else, right?
I think we're a bridge to the outside org, but hopefully that bridge is constantly shrinking, right? I mean, the ultimate goal is to connect people and to not be a proxy. And so ideally, like let's take a sprint review, for example. If we're in a sprint review and a stakeholder has a question for the dev team, hopefully your stakeholders are attending your sprint reviews, right? They don't have to go through the Scrum Master. Initially, that might make sense, but let's get to where the dev team and the stakeholders are talking directly, right? Let's get to a point to where the Scrum Master doesn't have to be in the middle of every conversation because they've made such a great connection between people. But yeah, initially it's a bridge, and that bridge will hopefully shrink over time.
Makes sense. Let's talk now about the product owner. What is the intent of this role? An example would be great.
So a product owner, they are there to maximize the value of the work that's to be performed by a dev team. So they are watching the dollars and the cents. All right. They are there. They're protecting the investment being made by the organization. They are there to define what winning looks like, what value actually means. Right. So we like to say during our scrum.org courses that there's 3 V's of product ownership: vision, value, and validation. So they're there to provide the big product vision of our efforts. Like what's the impact we're trying to have on the world by executing on this project. The second V is value. So they're not only do they set the vision, they define what value actually means, right? So how do we know we've put something good into the world? This is what that could mean. And then finally, validation. They're responsible, they're accountable for checking to see what we delivered. Did it actually reach the value we set out to get? And so, yeah, that product owner is a very busy person because not only do they have their Scrum responsibilities, they're also still an Agile product manager. So they're out talking to customers and they're doing A/B testing and they're doing market research and they're doing meetings with leadership and management to discuss budgets. And they've got all of these huge responsibilities outside of Scrum, but then a lot of work with the Scrum team as well. And but if I were to sum it up, value is what the product owner is all about. They are there to make sure that what we're building is what people actually want, right? And that what we're investing in running a Scrum team, that we're going to get a good return on that. Does that help?
Yes, it does. And I want to talk more about what you said about the Scrum Master being really busy because that's a lot of charter. So, in your book, you say that it's important to have one product owner for a product. The
Yep.
Scrum Guide says that the product owner is one person, not a committee. In one of our previous episodes, 161, there was a concept of a product owner team that was explored. So, from my point of view, the goal, as I understand, is really to speak with one voice to the dev team. If that's correct, why be so dogmatic about having it be one person? Because it's a lot of work. It could be a huge product as well.
Yeah. So we need one voice for a product, right? So I did not listen to 161. I'm not sure what they meant by a product team. In Scrum, we have one person whose voice is respected by the entire organization, who can make decisions tactically, strategically, and financially about a product without waiting, without permission. Part of the reason that we have a single empowered product owner is that we don't want to wait for decisions to be made, right? When we have a proxy product owner or even a team of product owners, let's say that I'm on a team of product owners. Well, there's always one head product owner, regardless of the team, right? And what if I don't have the authority to make the decision that my Scrum team is asking me about? So now I have to go get an answer from someone else. I've become a proxy. This causes delay. This also it could cause wasted work. It could cause waste in a product, especially if I don't communicate the need correctly to this head person and that person makes a decision that it's just there's so many errors and issues that come up. In Scrum, we have one empowered voice, one empowered person. Now, that doesn't mean that the product owner cannot get help, right? So when it comes to product backlog refinement, there's no reason why the dev team cannot do that for a product owner. There's no reason why, some of these activities cannot be shared amongst the entire Scrum team. But what it comes down to is this: there is one person held accountable for the value of a product on a Scrum team. And as long as we get that, the way that you configure it, I'm not all that worried about it.
Thanks for that, Ryan. You talked about the product owner, but I didn't hear you mentioning the word backlog. Is that right?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, a product owner expresses value through a product backlog. They also express their vision for the product through a product backlog, right? So a product backlog holds all of the things that we could do in order to achieve our product vision and in order to put value into the world, right? And so the way that a product owner expresses these things is through product backlog items, which could be a feature, a story, a bug, whatever it is that we're going to work on. And they order that product backlog by what they value most. And so I just see a product backlog as an expression of vision and also an expression of value. This is the tool that they use. This is the artifact they use to communicate vision and value with the dev team and with stakeholders.
Calling all developers. There's no telling what you can create when you upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. Are you ready to build the applications you want, however you want them? Are you ready to develop applications faster than ever? Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris.
Okay, let's segue now to the dev team with that. You mentioned cross-functional teams earlier. How critical is that? What's the difference between having feature teams and component teams?
Scrum allows both. And so I want to get that out of the way quickly, that Scrum allows features teams, it allows component teams. When I'm talking about a cross functional team, though, what I mean is this is a team who can deliver an increment of product on their own. They're not dependent on another team to do something for them, right? And this is the goal, because this kind of team can move quickly. Look, we implement Scrum in an organization to use it as a competitive advantage. Part of that competitive advantage is time to market, being able to take an idea and get it out into the world quickly. And so, just like with our product owner discussion, if we have to wait for decisions, if we have to wait for permission, if we have to wait for these proxies, we lose time. If a dev team has to be dependent on another team to get something done, we lose more time, right? We're giving up this competitive advantage by organizing ourselves in bad ways. And so, when we say cross functional, this team can build and ship a product increment on their own. And when we say a single empowered product owner, what we're saying is this person can make the call so that we're not waiting because look, implementing Scrum is a huge investment. It's very expensive to get me to teach a class. It's very expensive to hire an Agile coach. It's very expensive to hire Scrum Master. Look, we spend so much money doing this. It must be a competitive advantage to the organization or else it's a waste, right? And so the things that I'm talking about, self-organizing teams, cross-functional teams, empowered product owners, all of these things get us to that competitive advantage so that the investment in this Scrum adoption is worth it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So my next question was going to be what, creates this high performing team. Is there anything you want to add to that besides what you mentioned, cross functional teams, empowered teams, and a single product owner?
You know what? I think leaving teams alone for a while helps us get to a high performing team. I think people need time to learn how each other work, and they need time to build relationships, and they need time to get used to how one another is going to function and work together and learn the team norms and all those great things. I think one of the saddest things that Todd and I kind of talked about in our book, far too many companies will go down this path of adopting Scrum and they'll have this one pilot team and they'll get this Scrum team together. And usually these teams can do pretty well, right? And so they start performing and they start doing great things. And over 12 to 18 months, whatever the timeline is, they get to high performance. And then the organization says, wow, we've got 10 people who understand Scrum really well now. So let's break these 10 people up. Let's put them into 10 separate teams. And that's how we're going to grow agility. And it always makes me really sad because I look at it and I think, why would you ever slaughter a unicorn? Like, why would you do that? If you have this high performing team who's taken the time to work together, to gel, to form and norm and storm and do all those great things and finally get to high performance, why would you wreck that? Right? It's such a rare thing. And so I think time is one of those big ingredients too. Give people time to work together. Give them time to come together as a team. I think when I talk about this in my classes, I talk about the dream team. So USA basketball, right? The first time that the Olympics allowed professional players in, and we sent Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player of all time, by the way. Michael Jordan is the GOAT. We sent him and Larry Bird and Magic Johnson and Patrick Ewing and Chris Mullins and Christian Leitner and all these, John Stockton, Karl Malone. I think Barkley was on Dream Team 1. I mean, Elijah won. We sent the best of the best, and they almost lost their first game, right? They didn't know how to play well together. And it took some time and some practice and some coaching to figure that out. And I think it's the same with developers. We could have the best developers on the planet, but on day one, they're not going to be great together. It takes that time to actually figure that out. And so I think time is a huge, huge factor in giving teams the space and time to learn how to be high performing together. I think that's really crucial.
Fair enough. However, I'm not sure I completely agree with not changing a team once it's formed. Many things happen. A team member may want to do something else. Some of our previous episodes did deal with the concept of travel between teams, where people did want to try different projects or different technologies, or they were experts in certain areas that they wanted to seed in other teams. They also dealt with this concept of guilds, where people from many teams could come together on a specific topic so that there's more awareness. So I'm not really sure what you exactly meant by leaving teams alone because, in practice, that may not be possible.
Well, I think if we're not going to follow that, I think we have to acknowledge that every time we change the composition of a team, we are going to have lower performance for a while. And I think if we go into those decisions understanding that we are causing a team to perform at a lower level for a decent period of time by switching people in and out, then I think it's a fine decision. But we have to know we're making that trade off.
So let me ask you this. Scrum recognizes or doesn't recognize title for dev team members, regardless of
Right.
what they actually do. What happens in practice? What is the role of technical leads?
You know what? That kind of fades away on a self-organizing team, right? A technical lead is those people are typically more senior in their career. They're usually great technologists. They're still very valuable on a Scrum team. We just don't recognize one voice higher than another on a Scrum team, right? Everyone, it's equals among it's like the round table, King Arthur's court, right? It's equals among many, and yeah, so I think those kind of ideas kind of fade away after a while, and we just become highly collaborative. We respect one another. We leverage each other's experiences. We rely on one another. We help one another, and we don't worry about those titles so much, right? I mean, really, the lead developer kind of titles, it's really tied to compensation. And so if I'm in a Scrum Master role, I'm going to go to HR and say, look, by creating hierarchies in our teams, we're really causing some issues with self-organization. We're causing some issues with our team culture. Is there a different way that we can compensate people fairly for experience without creating all of this hierarchy on a team? And let's sort through that. Let's actually address the issue. And that's something a good Scrum Master will recognize quickly and seek to correct.
Okay, switching gears a little bit. The organization has decided to adopt Scrum and they decided to do feature teams. And they have, let's say, 4 or 5 feature teams, and they all contribute towards the end product. It is important to ensure consistency between the different, let's say, pages or UI pages that are implemented by these feature teams. How do you do that? How do you ensure consistency between what multiple teams are doing?
Yeah, so in Scrum, when we have multiple teams working on the same product, we have to set a baseline definition of done. And so branding standards, UX UI controls, and all of those things go into a definition of done, right? And so when we have that base definition of done, the 4 or 5 teams all agree to follow it. It's a shared understanding of what completeness means. It's a shared understanding of what potentially releasable means. Now, all of those teams can go back and make the guideline, can make the definition of done more strict. They can hold themselves to a higher bar of quality, but what they cannot do is circumvent the common areas that all the teams have agreed must be consistent. And so I think the definition of done handles those things beautifully. I think having, in the case that you mentioned, it's really a UX UI concern, right? It's this user experience, user interface stuff. Guess what? They're members of Scrum teams, right? UX UI is a first class citizen in Scrum, and so I think really leaning into that idea as well. But I think right now I usually see teams leverage a great definition of done to make sure that they are staying consistent in the areas where there are some corporate standards and things that need to be followed.
So, new realities are causing remote and geographically dispersed teams to be more prevalent.
Yep.
Does that make it harder to ensure this consistency?
You know what? I think teams can figure that out. Now, I will say remote does make it more difficult. I just had an article published over on Silicon Republic that basically said, look, Scrum Masters, your job is now much, much harder, right? The challenges of remote amplify your challenge to help with individuals and relationships and collaboration and these organizational impediments, because they're going to be hidden even deeper, between Zoom calls and all these other things, right? And so, yes, the job that it becomes more difficult, and we take on some more complexity in this space. But I also believe that truly cross-functional, self-organizing development teams with strong product management, product ownership, and with a Scrum Master who is well versed in facilitation, coaching, mentoring, teaching, training, all of the stances that we have to follow, they will find ways to sort this out, right? I don't think these are impossible challenges, but I will say this: the nature of remote work amplifies the impediments that currently exist in your organization. And so it becomes even more crucial that a Scrum Master has no tolerance for these things and gets them out of the way, because the impact is now 10x given the remote nature of our work.
Thanks, Ryan. So I want to talk now about the key artifacts. Let's start with the product backlog. And I'd like to understand your perspective on ordering versus prioritizing items. I believe the Scrum Guide focuses on the ordering.
Yeah, so this is a hot topic. Every class I teach, we have to spend quite a bit of time here because it is such an ingrained thing that we prioritize things. When it comes to product backlogs, if we use the word priority, we're using the word priority wrong. And let me explain that. I will often get asked, what are my priorities in my life? And when I get asked that question, I'll say my family, right? And then I get quiet and people are like, well, what's out? What else, right? And I say, well, look, if I say anything else, then I have invalidated my family as being my priority. You cannot have two things as your top priority, right? There's only one thing there. And so by definition, the word priority is singular. You can't once you say another thing that's a priority, you've invalidated that first. If I say family, if I were to say whatever anything else after that, I've invalidated my family as a priority. So priority is not the right word to use there. I would also say if we get past the semantical argument. So some people will say you're being semantic, that doesn't matter. Well, first of all, words are very important in culture. And so I would argue back that the words we choose to use can change behavior. Okay. And so as a Scrum Master, we're very careful with words. And so with the word priority, fine, let's indulge this for a second. Everything in my product backlog is priority number one. Which one should you do first? Now, the answer is usually all of it, right? So this implies that everything will be done on a product backlog and everything is of equal importance. Neither of these things are true in Scrum. There's no guarantees that a product backlog item will be completed, and they are not all equal. And so the word priority causes some weird behavior that we're trying to get away from. When we order something, we are putting an explicit order to the product backlog. This is the most valuable thing. This is the next most valuable thing. This is the next most valuable thing, so on and so forth. This is an expression of value. It shows us what are the most critical things. It also gives us opportunities to make decisions about things lower on the product backlog that may or may not get done. And so it also shows us that there's some uncertainty. And so we're trying to get the most valuable things out first, right? And then we're trying to figure out if these lesser value things even need to be done. And that leads to a different set of behaviors, right? Now we're being empirical. We're inspecting and adapting. We're driving off of value, not off of scope. It changes the way that we think about things. And so, short answer, priority is not sufficient, right? We need an order to the product backlog to understand value, to understand the vision, and to be able to make trade-offs and decisions because it is not certain that all the work is going to get done and not all of the work is equal. Does that help?
It does help. And I also noticed your book that recommends having the product backlog support a short term vision, a midterm vision, and a long term vision.
Yep.
And the short term, I suppose, corresponds to the minimal viable product.
Yep.
How do you get from the midterm to the short term?
You know what? We have to be the product owner job is very difficult. And I have a lot of respect for the great product owners in our community. They have to be ruthless, right? They have to be ruthless about what's valuable. They have to be ruthless about what's needed. Look, we use Scrum as a risk mitigation framework. And the sooner we can get something in front of a customer, the sooner we can get feedback. Now, if it takes us 18 months to get a minimally viable product out, we are at huge risk, right? We've got 18 months of investment and we're not sure if this thing's important. Now, if we can just get down to 1 month and showing a customer something, well, we've just cut risk by quite a bit, right? And so I think it really comes down to excellent product ownership is how we get from that bigger vision to that MVP and realizing that, the sooner we get something in front of a customer, the sooner we can validate all of our assumptions. Because keep in mind, everything in your product backlog is an assumption. You're assuming this is valuable. We can't validate that the 3 V's, right? Vision, value, validation. We don't validate that what we did was valuable until we get something in front of a customer. And so the sooner we get in front of a customer, the sooner we can validate, the sooner we know we're on the right path, the more that we can protect our investment. All these great things flow. So it's a ruthless product owner, laser focused on value and validation that gets us there.
What about exploratory work? So sometimes that is needed. So what should this ruthless product owner do in that case?
Time box it to something as small and as meaningful as possible, right? I think far too many, this will manifest as like a spike. The dev team will ask for a spike. We're unsure between two different technologies. And often I'll say, you know what, take a sprint or two. If I'm in a product owner role, take one sprint, build it both ways, and let's evaluate and go forward if it's important enough, right? Otherwise, I'll say, look, we have a sprint to make a decision. You know, what does that experiment look like? But we time box it, and we basically say, look, there's a time box to this spike, to this exploratory work, and there's an outcome we're after. Either we're trying to make a decision, we're trying to learn about a technology, but we have a defined outcome of success for this experiment or a way to refute the experiment, and we time box it very strictly.
Makes sense. There's also, a lot of discussion I hear about the size of a backlog. I know there's a lot of discussion of that in your book as well. And the goal is not to get it too large, but how do you prevent that?
Well, it's funny. Like I do this keynote all over the world for, especially at Scrum, or I used to when I used to travel. Now we don't travel anymore, right? But one of the questions I'll ask is, all right, who in the audience has a product backlog? And all the hands go up in the air and everyone's all excited. Yay, we get to participate too. And it's a fun little aspect of the talk. And then I'll say, that's really cool. I'm glad we all have product backlogs. How many of you have a product backlog item on your product backlog that's older than 3 months? And everyone laughs and their hands stay up. And I say, all right, how about older than 6 months? And everyone gets kind of nervous because, oh, he's going to keep adding. And so now it's a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4. The record's 9 years. And so I actually stopped the keynote, had the lights brought up, got this person a microphone, and just I was like, man, what is it that's 9 years old on a product backlog? And turns out it was financial industry. It was a mainframe change on a back-end system. And the guy was adamant. It's like, no, Ryan, we have to make this change. I'm like, sir, it's been 9 years and you're still doing great. And it was like a light bulb moment for him, right? It was this idea that, oh, I can let this go, that things will be okay. I think that's the first step for a product owner, right? If it's been 9 years and your company's still running and you're still profitable and things are going on, you can probably get rid of that product backlog item. I think you'll be all right. But I also think it's important to understand that as a product owner, I can't keep track of 1,000 things meaningfully, right? Neither can your dev team. And in fact, it stresses everybody out. And so when Todd and I go into work with companies, one of the first things we'll say is, look, anything older than 6 months on your product backlog, cut it. And people freak out. And 6 months is arbitrary. Maybe it's 3 months, maybe it's 12 months. Pick a line, draw that line, and cut everything beneath that line. And when we do that, people get really freaked out. Let's put it on a secret spreadsheet. Let's say, just cut it. Because we promise you, here's the second thing that'll help a product owner, right? The second insight, if it's truly important, if the thing that we cut is just massively important, it will come back through feedback from your customers. I promise it'll come back if it's important. So let go of this idea that every idea is important. Let go of this idea of having to have this massive inventory of work. Focus on, again, leverage a Scrum value, the Scrum value of focus. Figure out what's truly important, cut the rest. If you cut a little too deep, your customers will tell you, and that idea will come back. And I think if they can embrace that idea and really believe it, it becomes a lot easier to shrink the size of these wildly overgrown product backlogs.
So, episode 389 might be interesting. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. It discusses what Basecamp calls a shape up method. So, they certainly believe having a backlog is a problem. And they also believe that Scrum pushes too many strategic decisions down. So, they recommend more time boxed projects and more upfront definitions before the team gets involved with that. So, it might be interesting to check that out for our listeners. So, I'll put that in. Let's talk about the sprint backlog now.
Sure.
What is it? Is that a forecast or a commitment?
Sprint backlog is a forecast, right? These are the things that we think we could achieve during a sprint. We're not committing to them. We believe that one or many of the things on the sprint backlog will help us achieve the sprint goal, which is where our commitment lies. So the sprint backlog is definitely a forecast.
So it's a forecast. So what is the inspection needed as the sprint progresses to make sure that it is in the right direction.
Well, every day during a daily scrum, we're going to take an opportunity to see whether or not we're making progress towards our sprint goal. And we're going to take a look at our sprint backlog and see what have we learned about this work so far? What kind of updates do we need to make? So when we're inspecting our progress towards the sprint goal, that sprint backlog is front and center. We may have to make some adaptations based on some things we've learned it is through doing the work that we learn about the work we need to do, which is why we meet every day in a daily scrum to update our sprint backlog, to track our progress towards the sprint goal, to collaboratively build a plan about how we're going to work together over the next 48 hours. And so we're continually inspecting the work because we're in a complex domain and we're learning about the work constantly, right? So if we knew everything up front, we'd just go do the work, we'd just build it, right? But we don't. And so we're learning, discovering, experimenting. And that sprint backlog is an expression of all of that learning during a sprint. We're updating it continually. We're keeping the work and the stage and our progress transparent and up to date. So we have to inspect and adapt frequently because we're constantly learning about the things we're building. Does that make sense?
Yes, but when you say we, you mean the dev team?
Yes, good call. Good follow up. Yes, I definitely mean the dev team with some product owner insights mixed in as well.
What about the Scrum Master?
You know what? It's not my job as a Scrum Master to keep the sprint backlog up to date. And it's not my job to build a burn down chart. It's not my job to babysit the dev team. And so here's the deal we make in Scrum. If the development team agrees to keep their progress visible and transparent, we agree not to pull them into constant status meetings, right? And so that's the deal. If they choose not to do that, then as a Scrum Master, I can't stop a manager or a director from saying, all right, come to this status meeting. I don't know where we're at. And so as a Scrum Master, that's not my job to manage their progress. And I'm not involved in that as long as I can manage that to happen, right?
So we are inspecting, the team's inspecting, and now they have to deal with a situation that the work is actually much larger than they thought. What do they do?
So that's a great moment to pull the product owner into a discussion, right? So the dev team and the product owner, they have a highly collaborative relationship. These two groups have to get along very well. So first of all, I'm very proud of this dev team, right? So they found an issue. They realize the work is too big, and immediately they go to their product owner and they say, look, what we thought was possible is turning out to be a lot bigger. So now we need to decide, how do we cut things? How do we change things? How do we reshape the scope of our sprint, which is really the sprint backlog, right? It's a forecast of scope. How do we reshape this so that we can still achieve our sprint goal, right? That might mean we're going to cut 2 or 3 things from the sprint backlog, but we're going to make sure that that sprint goal is still achieved. So we always protect the sprint goal, but the forecast of work can change based on what we learn. But it's going to be a collaborative decision and discussion with the product owner and the dev team. But ultimately, the dev team owns the sprint backlog. And so they can make changes as they see fit, but they are committed to achieving the sprint goal that was discussed during sprint planning and agreed to by the Scrum team. Does that help?
Yes, that helps. What about bugs? Should they be treated differently than features?
They're just another product backlog item. And it's up to the discretion of a product owner to decide whether or not a bug goes above or below a feature at any given point. Now, let me caveat that with, because I'm sure there's some listeners who are like, well, wait a minute, what about if production's down? The answer is, yeah, we solve that, right? I'd imagine I can't think of a product owner on the planet who would say, no, ignore the fact that prod's down. I need this new feature. So I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the system's working, things are happening, but there's some behavior we don't expect. Like that's kind of the scope for a bug. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So keep your eye on this sprint goal and
Yes.
collaborate with the product owner to see how best to get to that. That's kind of your recommendation.
That's just professional Scrum, right? That sprint goal gives us focus, right? And it's it's what we commit to. So it's focus and commitment. And so we have to be open to shifting scope, changing scope in order to maintain focus and to maintain that commitment. It's just That's professional Scrum, and that's how we act transparently. That's how we preserve delivery, is just by following that path.
Let's talk about the Scrum activities for a little bit.
Sure.
The daily Scrum. So, what is the Scrum Master's role in the daily Scrum?
Totally optional, actually. So the Scrum Master doesn't even have to attend. I think early on, while the dev team's learning how to best use the daily Scrum to their maximum advantage, it's very helpful to have a Scrum Master facilitate it. But quite honestly, as a Scrum Master, my job is just to make sure it happens and nothing more.
And we did talk about the team ensuring that they are progressing to the sprint goal. That's a key focus of the team in
Yep.
the daily Scrum. What about sprints? And before we get to sprints, there are these terms used done, and then there's done. What is the difference?
Yeah, done refers to the definition of done, and when I was a developer, I used to say, yeah, something's done, and but what I meant was that it was running locally. What the project manager heard was that it was deployed somewhere, and chaos would ensue, right? Because what when I didn't say done, I just said done, and so in Scrum we have this definition of done. It's a whole team. It's an organizational understanding of what it means to be potentially releasable. So when I say this product backlog item is done, what I'm saying is it could go in front of a customer, right? And that definition of done defines all the things. It makes everything that would have to happen for that to be true. For this PBI to be potentially releasable, for this product, whichever level you're thinking, for this thing to be potentially releasable, here's everything that has to be true. And it's not just tech stuff. Sometimes it's the marketing plan is complete, or the website is updated, or the training videos are done, or customer communication has occurred. Legal and compliance have signed off. There's all sorts of things that go into this definition of done that have absolutely nothing to do with writing code or creating product, but are essential to the organization, right? So what's interesting is it just makes it transparent, all the moving parts to ship something, and it really helps us avoid one of the worst things I ever did in my career as a developer was when someone came to me and said, can you just make this one little change quickly, and I said yes, ignoring like all of the things that needed to be done because I didn't know about all of them, and it led to chaos. This stops that. When someone says, can we just do this one little change, the answer is heck no. Look at this list of things that have to happen before we can say done. Now go talk to our product owner. Quit hassling me about this. But yeah, done means potentially releasable. Done is a look at completeness, and it just makes that transparent for everybody. It gets rid of done. I've even seen companies where done was where you could finally go to production. We've wiped all that nonsense out. Definition of done is just such a powerful tool for understanding what completeness actually means.
So, what about the sprint review though? If it's, the feature is complete, but all these other activities like documentation, marketing, etc., are not done, should the feature be demoed?
No, we should never show undone work in a sprint review, right? So professionals do not show undone work. So we can have a conversation about it. We can talk to our stakeholders about all the things that we did, but we do not. If we were to show a stakeholder something that was undone, even though we can say 1,000 times this is not ready, they might leave with the wrong impression, right? It could lead to misinformation. And besides, the sprint review, it's far more than just a demo anyways. Like this is an opportunity to meet with customers, users, stakeholders. This event is designed to get rich feedback about how the product's doing in the marketplace, updates about budgets, all with the intention. The actual outcome of a professional sprint review is an updated product backlog with the latest and greatest information about our product. And so the demo part is such a small part of it anyways. But in this case, to directly answer what you've asked, no, you do not show that work. You do not claim it as done. You don't even let someone leave with the misrepresentation or misperception that it is done. It waits till the next sprint or whenever you actually meet that definition of done. It's a pretty strict stance, isn't it?
That's exactly what I was thinking. And I was wondering though, doesn't it go against the need to get feedback early from the stakeholders?
You know what? We are holding a high bar of professionalism on Scrum teams, right? So I do not teach certified Scrum class. We are teaching professional Scrum. And so when we say we do not show undone work, we do not show work that doesn't meet the definition of done, we mean it. So what we need to figure out is, why didn't we get there? And so that's, sprint retrospective is the event after the review. What improvements do we need to make so that when we get to the end of a sprint, we have something to get feedback on? Because you're right, it's not a good thing to delay feedback. I mean, we've talked about that. The sooner you get feedback, the less risk you have, the sooner you know that you're on track. But if we start blurring those lines, if we start telling teams it's okay to show undone work, how long before it's okay to deploy undone work? How many lines do we cross there, right? So a professional Scrum team does not show work that does not meet the definition of done.
So I think, besides leadership buy-in, which you mentioned was an important prereq, what I take away from this is coming up with a definition of done is another important prereq.
I definitely think you need it during that. You need to have a definition of done ready during that first sprint, definitely. Yes. I could even go along with the prereq. I agree with you. It's important. People ask me, they say, Ryan, Scrum is so big. And in a sense it is. Where should we start? And I do not recommend doing all of it at once. Please, please, please do not use waterfall to implement Scrum. But I think a great starting point is the definition of done. Define done at an organizational and team level. And just doing that alone will change behavior almost instantly. It has to.
So demoing is a small part of Scrum, but it is a important part. And, there's talking, just explaining what was done, getting more feedback, etc. And we did talk earlier about the Scrum Master initially being a bridge, but over time, that bridge should get smaller and smaller, and the team should do the talking. So, can you talk more about that? Like, who should demo? You don't want everybody demoing, or do you?
So when there is a demo component to a sprint review, I've seen it done many different ways. The one person I would say who should not do that is the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master is facilitating. They're there to make sure the event happens, that it's moving in a positive direction, but they are not the center of attention, right? One of the hardest parts about the Scrum Master role is that none of it's about you, right? It is about everyone else. And it's really hard, especially when you come from a leadership, a project manager, that kind of background, to really deprogram that. It takes a long time to sink that in. But, to your question directly, like who's really doing these different things? I would rather the dev team, if we are going to show work, that the dev team runs that. If we're going to talk about budgets and progress, that the product owner is running that. If we're collecting feedback or engaging with, stakeholder, I'd really love to see the product owner in the mix of that. And so I think the people accountable for that work should be the ones actually responsible for showing that work. And so, yeah, I think the dev team can demo their own stuff. They don't need someone speaking for them, and the product owner can manage their stakeholders. And you know what, though? I love seeing, here's like a tip that probably did not make it in the book. When I see a product owner deferring to a dev team member to answer a question for a stakeholder, that's a really good signal that the relationship's going well, and that the product owner trusts the dev team, and that the dev team has shown that they're professionals. And so I'm looking for those little things as well. But yeah, the people closest to the work should be the ones talking about and showcasing and demoing and discussing the work.
So, Ryan, I think your answer to my next question is going to be follow the framework, but I'll ask it anyway. What happens if the organization does everything else but doesn't hold retrospectives? What is the impact?
They never improve. That's tragic, right? Continuous improvement is essential for agile practices and for a Scrum implementation. If we skip the retro, I mean, we never sit down and figure out how we could get better. It's almost like we're wasting the whole investment, you know? That would be tragic. That's a bummer. Follow the framework. Your answer is right.
Okay, let's start to wrap up, but I'd like to ask you first, is there any critical topic that might be covered in your book or you want to talk about that we did not cover today?
There's a chapter in the book that's in Fixing Your Scrum that Todd and I struggled with, and it's the one, he and I we're very aligned in our views on Scrum and professionalism. But there's a chapter in there, there's a management chapter, working with management, respecting management. And we really struggled because it should not be in the book, right? It's not. But what we found was Scrum Masters have had so much trouble relating to management. Like, my background is in management. Like, I worked through the Fortune 500 up the leadership chain. Like, I've worked in the role, and I was always frustrated with the way Scrum Masters would try to talk at me or try to tell me that I was wrong, or that. And so we decided, you know what? There's a chapter in there about working productively and positively with management and leadership, trying to meet the needs that they're expressing, but in a way that still honors the values and principles of Scrum. And I think that chapter, it's the one chapter that's generated the most emails, I think, positive and negative. So some people do not like the fact that we're holding the Scrum Master accountable for bad relationships with leadership. But if you're not fulfilling that role, or if you're not fulfilling that service level, it is kind of your fault. But I think that's a chapter to focus on. I think it's just so important to understand that our service to the organization is essential to our Scrum team success. And the better relationship we have with management and leadership, the faster we can get impediments removed. And if we approach them in positive, productive ways, like if we partner with leadership and management instead of turning them into the enemy, we can get a lot more done. And I think that's a chapter that every Scrum Master should definitely read.
Awesome. What is the goal of your podcast, Agile for Humans?
You know what? It started as there was a group of us who would get together and just talk. And so Esther Derby, Don Gray, George Dinwiddie, Woody Zuhl. I mean, I have no idea why I was ever on any of those calls. Like, I did not deserve a space there, but fortunately they let me join in. And one day Don and I were talking, and it was actually Don Gray's idea. He said, Ryan, you should record these. And I was like, all right, but I mean, not even my mom would listen to this. And so why would we post it? But we posted it, and like 300 people listened to it within 5 or 6 hours. And we thought, whoa, wait a minute, that's kind of interesting. And so what the goal really is, we just want to get people together and have meaningful conversations about aspects of Agile without the tools and the big mechanisms and the big corporate, all this stuff. Like Agile for Humans, it sounds like a weird title, but it's really saying, look, this is for human stuff, right? We all have baggage and we're all wired differently and we're all these flawed human beings. And we're trying to honor and respect that and make sure that the conversations around Agile are focused on the people and the interactions and the collaboration, and not whether or not Jira can do a certain thing or whether or not Rally is the right tool, or just it's about people. And we want to just have that human-centric attitude towards the things we do. And hopefully the show achieves that, right? It's just real raw, direct conversation. And so far, I think people have kind of liked it. So hopefully we get that across. I don't know.
We'll put a link to your podcast and your book in the show notes.
Thank you.
How can people contact you?
RyanRipley.com is probably the easiest. At Ryan Ripley on Twitter. Ryan at RyanRipley.com for email. I'll tell you this, though. If you reach out and contact me, I promise to answer. So that's either like a good thing or it's kind of like a curse or a threat. I'm not sure which. But if you reach out, I'm happy to discuss any of these items, the book. You know what? If you do pick up the book, and I'd love to hear what you think, good or bad. Twitter is probably the best, at Ryan Ripley. But yeah, please give us your feedback. Todd and I we love hearing whether or not what worked, what didn't. Whether or not people are using pieces of the book to their advantage, if it's helping, all that stuff is just wonderful. So yeah, please reach out.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks all for listening, and thanks, Ryan, for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. This was a ton of fun. Really, some of the better questions we've gotten about this. So thank you so much. It was, I had to think a few times there, and so really enjoyed it. Like I don't know if you can tell, I could probably geek out on this stuff and talk about it all day. So really appreciate this opportunity.
Appreciate that. Bye, everyone.
Developers, take your marks. It's time to upgrade your data platform to InterSystems Iris. It's time to deliver complex mission-critical applications in the fastest route possible. It's time to use any data from any source. It's time to embed analytics and create interactive user interfaces. So what are you waiting for? Choose your language. Choose your tools. Choose your environment. Collaborate, build faster, and deploy more efficiently. Done and done. Tomorrow's next breakthroughs are waiting for you today. InterSystems Iris Data Platform. the fastest way to build applications. Ready, set, code. Start coding for free. Visit intersystems.com/try to try Iris. Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.